So recently, I've been given this old office PC that has been decommissioned from use. The owner tells me that it can no longer boot, and they don't know why. Taking a quick look inside, I can see that this PC has a lot of dust and grime, which would definitely impact the PC's cooling and will need to be addressed later. Below that was most likely a 4th generation Core i3 or Core i5 processor, which would make this PC worth restoring and rescuing, but I won't know that until I boot it up. I gave all the parts a quick look over to make sure nothing looked unplugged or out of place before turning it on. I suspect the hard drive as the main problem here, as I do hear some clicking sounds when booting it up. It would explain why the previous owner mentioned that the PC was sometimes unable to boot up. So before we turn this old PC into a budget gaming one, there are a few parts that we will need. The parts we select will need to be properly considered, as it wouldn't make much sense spending 1000 ringgit upgrading a PC that was going to be trashed. I will be upgrading the RAM, graphics, storage and casing, as well as cleaning up the dirt and replacing the thermal paste. Since I will be replacing the casing, I didn't bother cleaning up the insides of the old case before removing the components. I made sure all the cables were unplugged before unscrewing the 6 screws that held in the motherboard. The motherboard can now be carefully removed. Around back, there are just 4 more screws and the power supply can be loosened as well. I do need to get the cables out as they were previously tied down before removing the power supply completely. The old I/O shield will also need to be removed. We can now proceed to cleaning up the dust that's built up on these components. While removing the CPU heatsink, I noticed that only one of the 4 pins was properly inserted, which would explain why the CPU went up to 73 degrees Celsius when I entered the BIOS earlier. Since I don't have a brush handy, I just used some toilet paper to wipe down the surfaces, as well as a screwdriver to get into the tighter places, making sure not to wipe too hard as to not knock off any surface mount components. Turning my attention to the heatsink, you can see just how dirty the fans have become, turning the white toilet paper black just after one wipe. I decided to remove the fan from the heatsink to more easily clean out the dust when I realized I was going to need more than just tissue paper. Using a vacuum, I cleaned out the rest of the dust from the heatsink. I also wiped off the old thermal paste and gave the underside of the fans a good dusting as well. I chose to keep the stock cooler instead of purchasing an aftermarket one, as the processor was a non-overclockable Core i3 SKU, so it should do the job even if it was going to be slightly louder. I tried lining up the heatsink and attached the CPU fan before applying some new thermal paste from Cooler Master, then securing it into place, making sure all 4 pins are sticking out the other side of the board. Now is also a good time to add the 4GB stick of RAM, which brings the total to 8GB of dual channel RAM, which should meet most minimum game requirements of 2020. I bought this stick off of Shopee for only 62 ringgit. I did try to find a matching stick, however when it arrived, they still weren't the exact same model, so it will have to do. The casing I will be transferring these parts into is an old one that I used to use, but is still in good condition, and definitely looks better than the one it's currently in. I gave it a little dusting as well with the help of a vacuum and more wiping. Before setting in the motherboard, I routed the CPU 4-pin connector towards the top of the case, as the hole would not be accessible later. This is not necessary, but does make the build neater. Next is the I/O shield, which just snaps into the back of the case. I made sure not to screw in the power supply first to make inserting the other components easier. Using the holes in the I/O shield, I can then line up the motherboard with the screw holes in the case and screw it in. Next, I plug in the case I/O cables, which are for audio and USB. I followed it up with the rest of the power cables like the 24-pin and the CPU 4-pin which I routed earlier. Then came in the power and reset switches, which can be plugged in according to the labelings on the motherboard. After the cables have been plugged in, I can finally screw in the power supply back into place. For graphics, I knew I couldn't spend too much, which is why I looked over in the used market and found this 1050 Ti for around 400 ringgit. It is coming up to about 4 years old now, but it is still a capable card and should be a perfect pair for the aging Core i3 that's already in this computer. Before plugging it in, I did take off the cooler to repaste it and also give the fans a good dusting. When reassembling, I made sure to tighten the screws in a cross pattern to apply even pressure across the die. Plugging in the GPU is only a matter of lining it up with the PCIe slot on the motherboard and then screwing it into place. Since the old hard drive was dead on arrival, I bought a brand new 120GB SSD to use as a boot drive. If the user ever happens to need more space in the future, it will be very easy to add an additional 1TB hard drive. I will need to plug the SSD into power and also use the SATA cable which I scavenged from the old PC. I used the same screw that we used to secure the motherboard to hold the SSD in place. The next part is optional, but I decided to equip it with an internal wireless card from TP-Link, just to make the system feel a bit more modern. Installation of the wireless card is the same as the GPU, but this time in the 1X slot on the bottom instead of the 16X slot. Before I close up the side panels, I booted it up just to see if it was working. I also installed the latest version of Windows 10 using a USB boot drive, and luckily the original Windows license sticker was still on top of the old casing, so I can just reuse its serial key. So now that I've made sure it's working and also installed Windows, I can do some cable management and close it all up. So now that we're done, let's see how this PC performs. Doing normal everyday tasks feel very snappy, and video playback on Chrome is no issue at all, even up to 6K. But let's see how it does in gaming. As you can see from the charts, it is still a very capable PC as long as you set your expectations right and lower certain settings. Just like that, we have converted a PC that was headed for the landfill into something you can give for a friend or a cousin as an introduction into a PC gaming, or perhaps even use yourself if you're on a tight budget. It's not hard to find old PCs like this one on Facebook or Carousel for 100 or 200 ringgit and giving them new life, just like I have done. And with that, I would like to say thank you for watching and have a nice day.